Amid the ashes of World War II, Manila in 1945 became one of the most horrifying urban tragedies in human history. This was not merely a battle to reclaim a city. It was a clash of strategy, honor, and despair, where both American and Japanese forces were swallowed by the same storm of destruction that called itself liberation. In this episode, we retrace the final battle of the Japanese Empire in the Philippines through rare archival footage and original eyewitness accounts to understand why Manila was freed, yet its soul never returned. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, as the flames of war reached their fiercest height, the Pacific became the forge of empires. On that blood-stained map, the Philippines was more than a chain of islands. It was the soul of American honor and the key to Japan's doorstep. Every harbor, every airfield here served as a springboard for the final assault. At the heart of this storm stood Douglas MacArthur, the man who had once departed in bitterness, leaving behind the vow, "I shall return." Now he had returned, eyes hardened, resolve unshaken. He sought not only to retake Manila, but to wash away the stain of defeat. But to turn his vow, "I shall return," into reality, MacArthur would have to overcome not only the enemy before him, but the conflicting ambitions within his own ranks. While the smoke of battle still curled over Luzon, a quiet storm brewed inside the American command. General Walter Kruger, commander of the 6th Army, urged a slow and steady advance to secure logistics at Lingayen Gulf before driving into Manila. He knew that one rash move could expose his forces to a devastating counterattack from the northern hills. But MacArthur refused to wait. Every hour lost, he feared, might mean more prisoners executed and a city consumed by fire. He gambled on speed, believing the Japanese would declare Manila an open city, just as the Americans had done in 1942. Yet history would soon pose the haunting question: was that urgency the mark of strategic genius, or the seed of catastrophe? While the Americans debated caution versus speed, the Japanese side was collapsing under its own divisions. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, knew the balance of power had already tipped. He wanted to withdraw into the northern mountains of Luzon, establish a long guerrilla front, and bleed the enemy over time. But Vice Admiral Denshichi Okochi had other orders. He commanded Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi to hold Manila to the death, to avenge the battleship Kirishima, sunk at Guadalcanal. And with that command, tragedy took root. Some 17,000 men, shipwrecked sailors, Marines, mechanics, Korean and Taiwanese laborers, even civilian clerks, gathered in a last act of desperation. They had no tanks, no heavy guns, only 990 salvaged 20mm cannons ripped from aircraft, improvised mines, and bamboo spears tipped with bayonets. A city was about to become a fortress, and a fortress was about to become their collective grave. While General Iwabuchi was turning Manila into a fortress of desperation, MacArthur was preparing to deliver his decisive blow. On January 31st, 1945, he personally arrived at the front lines of the 1st Cavalry Division, a symbolic gesture from the man who had once left the Philippines in defeat, now standing at its threshold once more. At exactly 12:01 a.m., February 1st, the so-called flying column set out, marching over 100 miles of jungle and mountains in just 66 hours, a record-breaking advance in the entire Pacific campaign. Behind them, the 37th Infantry Division moved out as well, closing in from another direction to form a tightening pincer around the city. MacArthur had 3 clear objectives: rescue the prisoners at Santo Tomas University, seize Malacañang Palace, and restore the Philippine Legislative Building, the very symbol of Filipino sovereignty. He believed that if he moved fast enough, he could liberate Manila before it burned to the ground. But as his troops pressed forward, one question lingered. Was time still on his side? As the 2 American columns closed their encirclement around Manila, the first torch of freedom flickered to life amid the darkness of war. On the night of February 3, 1945, armored vehicles from the 8th Cavalry Regiment smashed through the gates of Santo Tomas University, where thousands of Allied prisoners had been held captive for 3 long years. The moment the gates swung open, 3,500 Americans, Britons, and Dutch burst into tears, embracing their liberators as if they had just been pulled out of hell itself. Yet, the joy was not complete. 63 Japanese soldiers still held out inside the main building, keeping 275 hostages under their control. Negotiations dragged on until February 5th before the final surrender. But almost immediately, the war changed color again. Japanese forces blew up the Novaliches Bridge, severing supply lines and leaving the Americans burdened with thousands of freed prisoners, yet short of ammunition and food. Liberation had begun, but the true trial was only just ahead. But the victory at Santo Tomas was only the prelude to a new nightmare. Manila was still in enemy hands. Immediately after the rescue, the 37th Infantry Division pushed into Tondo, a densely packed northern district where every street corner could turn into a battlefield. Amid the smoke and gunfire, they discovered 1,330 prisoners abandoned inside Balabid Prison, their survival hanging by a thread. Every block became a separate engagement. Mines buried in the rubble, barbed wire stretched across alleys, interlocking fields of fire from upper floors. When American troops crossed the Estero de la Reina Bridge, they were met with a storm of bullets and 500-pound bombs exploding all around them. Through the chaos, civilians poured into the streets, cheering through tears, waving in joy, and screaming the names of loved ones lost in the ruins. By February 7th, the entire north bank of the Pasig River had been secured. But the Japanese, retreating with grim precision, demolished 6 bridges, turning the river itself into the dividing line between liberation and hell. After securing the north bank of the Pasig River, the Americans believed victory was only a matter of time, but the Japanese had no intention of retreating. They were turning the other half of the city into a vast fortress of concrete and fire. To stop the enemy from strengthening their defenses, General Oscar Griswold ordered a full encirclement of Manila. The 37th Infantry Division pushed eastward, while the 1st Cavalry swept south, forming a tightening pincer toward the heart of the city. Across the river, combat engineers fought both current and shell fire, rowing through the raging water, some using rifle butts as makeshift paddles after their oars were shattered by explosions. When the first 2-lane pontoon bridge finally went up, hundreds of terrified civilians surged across it, clogging the supply lines in their desperate flight. Amid that chaos, the soldiers came to a grim realization. They were no longer fighting merely to capture a city. They were fighting to save the living from the inferno. The encirclement had closed, but inside it, Manila had become a labyrinth of death. As American forces pushed deeper into the city's heart, they discovered that every building, every street had been turned into a bunker. The Provisor Island power plant was transformed into a fortress of steel. It took 2 days and 25 lives to capture it. At Paco train station, a web of 20mm gunfire surrounded the troops, turning the place into a maze of smoke, bullets, and corpses. American soldiers charged 10 times in succession, 45 killed, 307 wounded, to gain only a few hundred meters of ground. Confronted with such carnage, MacArthur was forced to lift his restrictions on artillery. On February 10th, the thunder of 105mm and 155mm guns filled the air. Tanks crushed through walls, and flamethrowers with phosphorus grenades consumed every pocket of resistance. Manila was no longer a city. It had become a hell forged from concrete and fire. After American artillery turned the industrial districts into seas of fire, it seemed that all resistance had finally collapsed. But in the very heart of the city, a new fortress rose from the ruins. Along Marquis de Comilla Avenue, the police headquarters, a shoe factory, and a nearby school had been welded together by Japanese defenders into a single block of concrete defiance. For 8 consecutive days, American troops fought room by room, floor by floor. Every door they kicked open unleashed a storm of bullets and grenades. Blood mixed with smoke, concrete split under flamethrowers and 105mm shells, and the entire neighborhood became a sealed battleground where each meter of wall was paid for with human lives. Meanwhile, the 1st Cavalry Division tightened its outer cordon, applying what one officer called a medieval siege, slowly choking the city from the outside in. Manila was no longer a campaign. It had become a siege, a place where the line between enemy and hell itself had vanished. While smoke still hung thick over the police district, the siege of Manila entered its final phase. To tighten the noose, the 5th and 8th Cavalry Regiments crossed the river under heavy artillery fire, seizing the Makati power plant on February 10th, preserving the city's last vital source of electricity. 2 days later, they pushed westward to the sea, then swept north along the coast, linking up with the 37th Infantry Division and completing a steel pincer from land to bay. Along their advance, fierce battles erupted at Harrison Park, Rizal Stadium, and De La Salle University, where every classroom had been turned into a bunker. By February 16th, the 1st Cavalry Brigade was redirected toward the city center, storming the Manila Hotel and the High Commissioner's office, where MacArthur himself appeared amid the ruins, standing before the city he had sworn to liberate. Yet within that moment of triumph, Manila was dying, slowly, painfully, day by day. After the coastal pincer closed tight, only scattered pockets of resistance remained in Manila, yet each one with its own private hell. On February 19th, the exhausted 148th Infantry Regiment was pulled back after days of brutal combat, replaced by the 5th Cavalry advancing into the University of the Philippines campus and its teaching hospital. What had once been a symbol of knowledge and healing had become a fortress of death, riddled with tunnels, booby traps, and firing positions carved into the rooftops. The Japanese fought with utter desperation, turning every hallway into a corridor of death. After 4 days of relentless combat, 75 of the 250 defenders committed suicide, closing yet another horrifying chapter in the Battle of Manila. When American troops finally freed 7,000 surviving civilians from the hospital ruins, there were no cheers, no triumphant shouts, only the silence of people who had walked through a nightmare and lived. Because sometimes the price of liberation is paid with the very survival of a city. After the hospital was secured, the flames of war spread toward the most sacred ground in Manila, the walled city of Intramuros. Within its 40-foot thick stone walls, once the heart of old Spanish Manila, now stood the final, desperate stronghold of the Japanese. From February 17th to 23rd, American 105mm, 155mm, and even 8-inch guns poured fire onto the ancient citadel, turning its tile roofs and bell towers into cascades of falling stone. On February 23rd, under the cover of drifting smoke, the 129th Infantry Regiment assaulted from the north, while the 145th struck from the east. But inside those walls lay a horror even the bombardment could not hide. 2,000 women and children were imprisoned in the Delmonico Church, while the men were executed at Fort Santiago. To root out the defenders, U.S. troops were forced to use gasoline, phosphorus grenades, and flamethrowers, clearing the tunnels chamber by chamber. By February 25th, the ancient fortress collapsed. The next day, Admiral Iwabuchi committed suicide, taking 17,000 souls with him into the abyss, and the heart of Manila stopped beating. The walled city of Intramuros had fallen, but the Battle of Manila was not yet over. Amid the smoking ruins of the capital, 3 massive concrete structures still stood defiantly: the legislative, finance, and agriculture buildings. Once symbols of government authority, now transformed into the final steel citadels of the Japanese. From February 25th to 28th, American 155mm guns fired at point-blank range. Tanks crushed the foundations, and sheets of flame swept through the basements. Every window became a machine gun nest, every room a killing ground. On March 1st, the Americans issued a call for surrender. The only reply was silence, and the thick black smoke rising from within. 2 days later, the finance building collapsed, and General Griswold sent a brief message to Kruger. All resistance has ended. Manila was liberated, but at the cost of its total destruction. A victory with no triumphant fanfare, only the lingering echo of fire and falling concrete. When the last gunshot finally faded, Manila did not cheer. It sank into the silence of ash and blood. For in those 3 weeks of fighting, the true horror did not lie on the battlefields, but inside homes, churches, and schools. In the districts of Tondo, Paco, and Armida, Japanese troops unleashed their despair upon civilians. Women and children were herded into churches, doused in gasoline, and burned alive. Men were slashed, stabbed, or thrown into the Pasig River. At the Bayview Hotel, torture and mass rape took place behind closed doors. American artillery made no distinction either. Many civilians died in the very shelters where they sought refuge. When the smoke cleared, the numbers chilled the world. 1,010 American soldiers killed, 5,565 wounded, nearly 16,700 Japanese troops dead, and over 100,000 civilians massacred. Manila was liberated, but also erased, becoming one of the most devastating urban tragedies of World War II. When the casualty numbers were finally announced, the world fell silent. Manila had been liberated, but its soul had not. The city once hailed as the Pearl of the Orient was now nothing more than ash and shattered stone. Intramuros lay in ruins. Electricity and water were gone. Transportation had collapsed. Nothing remained but rubble and dust. American troops had to put aside their rifles and become rescuers, building temporary bridges, clearing mines, stopping looters, and finding shelter for tens of thousands of newly homeless civilians. At night, soldiers gathered for film screenings or dances, trying to forget the 3 weeks of hell they had survived. Yet the echoes of war still thundered in their minds. Manila had been restored on the map, But in the hearts of those who once lived there, it was no longer a city. It was a memory erased. And so the question lingers. Was this victory worth the price paid in human lives? In the ashes of Manila, the Americans began to look back. What had this victory truly cost? From a military standpoint, the Battle of Manila became a harsh, unforgettable lesson in the power of combined arms warfare. Once the artillery restrictions were lifted, guns, tanks, and flamethrowers worked in tight coordination, crushing one concrete strongpoint after another. The results were undeniable. American casualties dropped from 26 a day to just 6 in the final phase of the battle. For the Japanese, it had been a struggle waged in pure desperation. No artillery, no tanks, no communications, no air support. Only willpower. But willpower, no matter how ironclad, cannot stand against the industrial firestorm of the 20th century. Manila was not merely a tactical victory. It was a warning etched in fire. When overwhelming technology and firepower collide with blind stubbornness, the only outcome is ash and silence. No tactic can be perfected enough, no firepower overwhelming enough, because no gun can rebuild the soul of a city. From the rubble of war's harshest lessons, Manila 1945 rises as a cold reminder. This was the only true urban battle of the Pacific, the place where American forces liberated Luzon and opened the road toward Japan. But within that victory, an entire city was erased from the human map. For when war enters a city, every home becomes a fortress, and every family can become a victim. The fires of Manila did more than burn down the stone walls of Intramuros. They burned away the memories of an entire generation, those who lived, who died, and who lost their entire world in those 3 weeks of hell. And that is its eternal warning. If humanity forgets the value of peace, history will ignite flames like Manila once again.